Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and we are so pleased that you've joined us for this live webinar today with Rabbi Danny Nevins, who I'll introduce in a moment. We're really pleased to be offering this program today as part of the Day of Halachic Study, sponsored by the Rabbinical Assembly's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, a conservative movement event during which conservative Masorti congregations, communities, and schools have come together this year to study Rabbi Nevins' responsum halachic perspectives on genetically modified organisms. I want to make sure you also know that we have many more online programs offered throughout the year. We have 7 live online mini courses coming up in the next academic year, as well as live stream broadcasts of all of our public lectures. If you sign up using the sidebar at the right side of your screen, we will be sure to notify you about all of those programs. So today's webinar, Rabbi Nevins will present until approximately 12:45 Eastern Time, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A until 1 o'clock Eastern Time. We would love to get your questions. Please email them to onlinelearning@jtsa.edu. I know that address is there on your screen, onlinelearning@jtsa.edu, and please include your name and location. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. If you haven't yet downloaded the handout with today's sources, you can do so at the link above your video. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Rabbi Daniel Nevins, who is the Pearl Resnick Dean of the Rabbinical School and Dean of the Division of Religious Leadership here at JTS. He previously spent 13 years as Rabbi of Adat Shalom Synagogue in Farmington Hills, Michigan. Rabbi Nevins represents JTS on the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Rabbinical Assembly, and he's written responsa on halachic topics including personal status, disabilities, bioethics, technology, and sexuality. He earned his bachelor's degree from Harvard, his master's degree and rabbinical ordination from JTS, and it's not in your bio, but you've also transformed the rabbinical school, and I wish I were there now instead of years back. Anyways, thank you so much for doing this teaching for us today.
Thank you so much, Julia, and welcome to everybody. I'm truly honored and delighted to be part of this day of study. It's summertime, my favorite season, because I love to get out into nature. In just about a week, I'll be hiking in the Adirondack Mountains, and I like to get into a place of discomfort where I can encounter nature in all of her beauty and all of her brutality. Hopefully not all of her brutality. After all, I will be filtering my water so I don't get giardia, and I'll be carrying a bear whistle so I don't become someone's dinner. You see, the love we have for nature is connected with our desire to live comfortably within nature and sometimes to shift nature. And so in order for it to help support our own goals in life. We like to think of the world as a natural location, and of our foods, we like to eat natural foods, non-GMO foods for many of us. And yet the truth is that humans have been modifying the world around us since the beginning of humanity, certainly since the beginning of civilization. Some 10, 11,000 years ago, what scientists call the Neolithic era was a time when humans began to breed plants and animals, to domesticate the grains that we're familiar with, and that livestock that live next to humans in farms. It was this process of domestication, of breeding, which was not truly understood, that allowed humans to develop stronger civilization and all the other benefits that came with it, all the culture and the learning, the civilization, and yes, even the religion that came as a result of our domestication of the world. And so when we speak about a natural state, the truth is that we have long since passed the time when we could say that we live without influencing the environment around us. However, up until very recently, humans were only able to select the variations that they observed and not to create new variations. Charles Darwin, in his great book on the origin of species, said that humanity is able to select the variables that occur, but is not able to cause them. Now, Darwin was not familiar with genetic theory, which the origins of it actually were beginning just around the same time as he was alive, in the work of Gregor Mendel and his famous pea plants. However, after that time, humans began to experiment with ways of directly modifying the genome, not only by observing and selecting desirable mutations, but also causing them. By 1973, people had, and scientists had, the ability to actually change the structure of the genome. And this caused a lot of beneficial results. Today, people who need insulin, for example, generally receive biosynthetic insulin, where the human DNA has been put into yeast or another type of bacterium or a plant in order to create this medication which is needed for humans. So much is happening, and it's happening so fast. If that was 1973, by 2011, two scientists named Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier had discovered how to use a naturally occurring system which was called CRISPR in order to make very dramatic and sudden shifts in the genome. CRISPR is a naturally occurring system in the RNA which allows bacteria to defend themselves against viruses. It allows the bacterium to identify a very specific sequence within the genome of the virus and then to go and clip it out and sew the genome back together. These scientists discovered, well, if that can be done in nature, we can do it as well. We can find very specific sequences within a genome of a plant or an animal and remove that sequence and sew the genome back together. In fact, we can also interpolate a different sequence in there, and in so doing, we can change the actual structure of the genome. This is very exciting, and it has many possible benefits. It has benefits for nutrition. You could have foods that have a better nutritional profile. It also has benefits for medicine. You could help to remove a mutation, like a single gene mutation, such as the one that causes sickle cell anemia, could be removed. And in that way, the descendants of that family would not have that disease. There are also some people who have very rare mutations which prevent them from developing cholesterol in their bloodstream. If you could find those families, that part of the gene, and then implant it into other humans, then other humans also would not develop high levels of cholesterol and would not develop heart disease, which is, of course, the greatest killer of them all. So you can readily understand the benefits in terms of nutrition and health that could come as a result of genetic engineering. And it's getting much easier to do. It's not only the great labs with multi-million-dollar budgets that are able to do genetic engineering. The system known as CRISPR is now possible to be done by even someone in their garage, even somebody without a PhD. And we are now entering a time when in China, labs are making rapid progress, if you want to call it that, in modifying human genomes. Now, there had been already back in the 1970s, a broad consensus that genetic engineering should be limited to somatic cells, that is, the cells that are in our bodies, mature cells. So if I had a genetic disease, you wanted to try to solve that, to repair that, great. But what about germline cells like sperm and eggs? If you make the modifications there, then the changes can be inherited. This is considered to be quite problematic because we just don't know what the consequences of our intervention will be down throughout the generations. On the other hand, we are also aware that we are not just the sum of our genes. The idea of genetic determinism, that everything that's in our genome is going to be expressed, is false. There's a new field called epigenetics in which we study the interaction between the genome and the environment. Certain environmental factors can either cause genes to be expressed or silence them. It's also possible that as a result of our experience in the world, there can be changes to our genome, and some of those changes can even be inherited. And so you see, it's quite complicated. Now you might wonder, well, what does this have to do with Judaism? Well, Judaism has, of course, from the very beginning, and I mean that quite literally, speculated and made assertions about the nature of life. If you think about it, the very first portion of the Torah, the portion known as Genesis, speaks about God creating each life form separately. This is what Charles Darwin called special creation, the idea that each species was created separately. This, of course, was in contrast to his idea of common descent, that all life forms descended from an original form of life and differentiated throughout the centuries and the millennia and the eons, really. That's in the first portion of the Torah. The second portion of the Torah, Noach, which has the story of the Great Flood, has God, the Creator, very concerned that no species will be lost. This is what we would call species continuity. And so the premise of the first two portions of the Torah is that all of life was created as it is by God, and that no life form has ever been lost. And you know what? That idea was a prevalent idea, a broad idea that lasted for millennia. It wasn't until the end of the 18th century that a French naturalist named Georges Cuvier discovered that all these fossils that were being discovered throughout Europe and then in Africa and other places and North America belonged to species which were not just rare but extinct. The idea of species extinction was resisted for a long time until the evidence was too strong. Then a geologist named Charles Lyell discovered that the world was much, much older than had been assumed, billions of years old. Right? And this is what allowed Charles Darwin to see that the small variations, generation after generation, would add up into speciation, into the great variety of species in the world. Well, our ancestors also knew about interventions that could blend different species. They had this idea that if you were to take one species of animal and mix it with another species of animal, you could come up with a hybrid. For example, a horse and a donkey could be mated together to create a mule. In fact, there's a fascinating little text in the Talmud, in Tractate Psachim, which says that on the first Saturday night of the world, God said to Adam, hey, I've got two ideas for you. I want you to do these two things. Take two stones and knock them together to make sparks, and you will invent fire. That's pretty impressive. The first human invention is fire. I think we'd all agree that that's a big one. But what was the second thing God told Adam to do? Take two animals, a horse and a donkey, breed them together, and create another species, a mule. Why in the world will the Talmud imagine God instructing Adam to create a new life form? We'll come back to that later, but I want you to understand that the rabbis already thousands of years ago were imagining the ways that humanity could change the very nature of life, and they were troubled by this. They called the mingling of species kilayim, mingling or mixed stuff. And for this, they depended upon the texts of the Torah. So we're going to go to our study sheet now. You were sent a study sheet, so I'm going to ask you to open up to the first text, which is from the book of Leviticus. Now, if I were to ask you what the most famous verse in the Torah is, perhaps the most important verse of the Torah, I'm sure you'd come up with different ideas, but my nomination would be Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Love your neighbor as yourself, I'm the Lord. Right? That's a really important verse, we'd all agree. Well, the very next verse after love your neighbor as yourself is the one I'm about to read to you. I wanted to ask you as we read it, is this a complete non sequitur or is there some logic to this flow? It says in Hebrew, Et chukotai tishmoru. Behemtecha lo tarbia kilayim, sadcha lo tizra kilayim, ubeged kilayim shatnez lo ya'aleh alecha. You shall heed my statutes. You shall not let your cattle mate with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, and clothing made of two kinds of yarn you shall not put on yourself. Oh my God! You go from love your neighbor as yourself to mixing different clothing together or breeding different animals together. What in the world is that about? Well, one theory might be that the book of Leviticus, which comes from the priestly section of the Bible, actually it's the centerpiece of what's called the Holiness Code, is very interested in a natural order, about keeping species distinct. And in fact, perhaps love your neighbor as yourself is about species sort of loyalty, that humans should look out for other humans. Yes, we have to protect all life, but we have a special obligation to protect human life. That's why we've got a command not to murder humans, and that's why we have a command to save the life of humans. And so it could be that this verse is saying that just as we should love our neighbor, which means to be loyal to your neighbor, because they are human, because they are like you, kamocha, so too we should try to preserve the order of nature, that the species of plants and the species of animals should all be kept distinct. And the word which implies the opposite of that, which explains the opposite, is called kilayim, the mingling of species. Now that verse from Leviticus is complicated. It's hard to know exactly what is meant. And so, as often is the case, the law is repeated later in the Bible, in this case in the book of Deuteronomy. Let's look at that verse. It divides one verse into three, and as you'll notice, it actually modifies each of the commands that were found in Leviticus. It starts with Lo tizra karmacha kilayim. Don't mix the seeds of your field with kilayim. Pen tikdash hamleah hazera asher tizra utvat hakaram. I'll read the English translation. You shall not sow your vineyard, now it's not just a field but a vineyard, with a second kind of seed, else the fullness from the seed you have sown and the yield of the vineyard may not be used. That parenthetical comment seems to imply that if you do this, you may in fact have a bounteous harvest, but you will not be allowed to use that harvest, it seems to imply. The next verse, Lo tacharosh b'shor v'chamor yachdav. You should not plow with an ox and an ass together. Now, wait a second. Don't plow with these animals together? What was Leviticus talking about? It spoke about mating different types of animals together. Now we're talking about plowing them? Notice the difference. And finally, it says, Lo tilbash shatnez, tzemer ufishtim yachdav. You should not wear clothing combining wool and linen. Now, in Leviticus, we were told don't make two different types of yarn, but now Deuteronomy comes and narrows it. It's not any two types of cloth, but it is the specific cloth of wool, an animal product, and linen, which is a plant product from the flax plant. So what you've got here now is sort of a narrowing when it comes to the clothing, and perhaps also with the animals. What's going on with those animals not plowing together? Well, one theory is that in the interim between when the book of Leviticus is edited and when the book of Deuteronomy is edited, farmers in the ancient Near East learned how to create mules. And so, if that's the case, they might have said, no, the Torah isn't saying don't breed animals together, it's saying don't plow with the animals together. And so we're okay. Perhaps. But then what's the problem with plowing with the animals together? Later interpreters said, well, if you take a very strong animal like an ox and a relatively weaker animal like a donkey and you put them on the same plow team, then the stronger animal is going to have an easier time and the weaker animal is going to have a harder time to keep up. So it's a type of cruelty to animals to pair them together. Maybe. There's even a theory that actually they're really the same law, that if you plow with these two different types of animals, then as Ramban Nachmanides says, that at the end of the day, you're going to put them out to pasture together or put them in a barn together. And who knows, that night they might have a workplace romance. They might actually breed together. Or plowing, there's some evidence that plowing was sort of an ancient bawdy expression, a euphemism for sex, plowing. In fact, there's even some proof for this because Samson has a riddle. He says, "Lulei charashtem be'eglati lo matzatem chidati." If you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have found out my riddle. So there seems to be some possibility that plowing and having sex were some kind of similar idea. But the important thing I want you to notice is in the beginning of the verse in Leviticus where it says, Et chukotai tishmeru, you shall heed my statutes. What is a statute? Well, we Jews tend to say a statute, a chok, is a law that doesn't have an obvious explanation. As Rashi says, it's gzerat hamelech. It's just like a decree of the king. You do it because God said to do it. But Nachmanides, Ramban, doesn't buy it. He says, no, every mitzvah in the Torah has a reason. So what's going on here is that God is saying, I want you to keep the world the way you found it. Keep the species distinct. That's what this mitzvah is all about. All right, so let's see how the rabbis take these biblical verses. There is in the Mishnah an entire book called Kilaim, which is all about forbidden species, forbidden mingling. And it actually expands on what the Torah said. The Torah, remember, said, don't mix seeds in the field. Don't breed animals of different species together, and don't mix different types of cloth in your garments, perhaps just linen and wool, shatnez. But the rabbi said, well, there's another type of mixing that you also shouldn't do. You can extend it. It's called grafting. You know what grafting is. It's when you take a plant that is rooted in the ground, you sort of behead it, you cut off the middle of the root stem, and then you take another plant and you bind it together. This happens in nature when branches of two different trees rub against one another. Sometimes they rub so hard that they start to grow together. But ancient farmers in the rabbi's time, for sure, 2 millennia ago, knew that there were benefits to hybridization, where you would take one plant and you would put it and graft it onto another plant. Why? Well, it could be that you used the lower plant, the rootstock or the scion, in order to convey the maturity, the winter hardiness, the disease resistance, the speed of growing crops to the new plant that was put on top of it. It was also a way of creating sort of a clone. If you had apples, say, that you really liked from an apple tree, you could take a branch from that apple tree and graft it onto another tree, perhaps even from a different species, a pear tree, or maybe even a thorn bush, and you would stick it on top there, and then you'd have a new apple tree, and you wouldn't have to start from beginning with a new plant altogether. And so you can see what the benefits are. The rabbis didn't like it. They considered this to be a type of kilaim. Now, interestingly, the rabbis said that you may not do this, but they did not then say that the fruit that comes from such a grafted product is forbidden. Why not? I don't know, but I have a theory. My theory is this. If you go to the farmer's market and you see all the beautiful produce that's laid out there, how do you know what kind of a plant it came from? How do you know that the apples that you choose at your farmer's market were not from a hybrid or a grafted apple tree? You don't. And if you were to say that you cannot eat the produce, you can have no benefit from the produce of a hybridized fruit, that means that you can only eat fruit that you grew yourself and you didn't graft. That means you'd be separating yourself from the entire food supply of your region. That's not a tenable plan. And so the rabbis said that we're not allowed to graft plants together, but then they did not further say that you are not allowed to eat the produce. If you look at that text from the tractate Yerushalmi, there's no Babylonian Talmud on Kilaim, but there is Yerushalmi. Just look at it for a minute in the English. You're not allowed to graft a barren tree onto a fruit tree, or a fruit tree onto a fruit tree of a different species. Why not? Because it says, guard my statutes. That's in the verse in Leviticus, right? And the rabbis then say, this seems to mean that you have to keep the plants the way they were since the time of creation. You can't even mingle a black fig onto a white fig. Now let's look at Maimonides, the third text there, for a minute. In his restatement of the laws of Kilaim, he repeats what the rabbis say, but then he sort of limits what they're saying a little bit. Let's look at the Hebrew there. Ein asur mishum kil'ei zra'im, ela hazra'im haru'im l'machal adam. He says, the only thing that's forbidden under the ban of mixing species of seeds together are the seeds which are edible for people. Aval esavim hamarim ukiyotze bahem ein ha'ikarin, min ha'ikarin she'inam ru'uyim ela l'refuah v'kiyotze bahem ein behem mishum kil'ei zra'im. However, bitter grasses and such that from roots which are not fit except for eating, which are not fit except for medicine, and similar plants are not included in the ban on mixed seeds. Now, many of you know that Maimonides, in addition to being a great rabbi and a philosopher, was a physician. And the medieval apothecary was very much created from herbals. Right? They would take different herbs and they would blend them together and mash them together. And he seems to be saying here that the only prohibition is on mixing different species to create a hybrid fruit for humans to eat. That would exclude any products which are used for animal fodder, and it would also exclude plants that are mixed together to create medications. That's very important for our current context, because if you think about it, we're talking about making modifications to the genome for medicinal purposes. And according to Maimonides already, we seem to have some support for the idea that if it's just for the sake of medicine, if it's for the sake of refuah, for healing, then it should be permitted. Okay, so that's Maimonides. He gives us a very practical permission. But now let's look at Nachmanides. I always emphasize it's Rambam is Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, and then Nachmanides is Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who lives a little bit later in Spain, and like Maimonides leaves Spain for Egypt. In Nachmanides' case, he made it to Israel. Now, Nachmanides is most famous to us for his commentary on the Torah, and in his comments on Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19, he speaks about the prohibition of kilayim. If you look at it, it's the second page of your handout. I'm going to focus on the third big paragraph, which is toward the bottom there, the second half of the page. And I'll read this for you in Hebrew and translate it. If my translation differs from the English one in front of you, don't worry, it's just Nevins versus Nevins. So he says, V'hatam b'kilayim, the reason why we are not supposed to mix the species together. Ki Hashem bara haminim ba'olam, because God created all the species in the world. Again, what Darwin called special creation. B'chol ba'alei hanefashot, b'tzmachim ba'alei nefesh hatznua, with all creatures, with humans and plants and all animals that move. V'natan bem koach hatolada, and gave them the power of reproduction. She'yit kaimu haminim bekam la'ad, kol zman she'yirtzehu yitbarach b'kiyum holam, so that all these species will be able to propagate themselves so long as the blessed Creator wants the world to continue. V'tziva b'kocham she'yotzil l'minehem, and God designed all species, that is all plants and all animals, that they would be able to reproduce themselves exactly, the same species. V'lo yishtanu la'ad le'olam, never would they make any change. Sorry, Darwin, Ramban doesn't agree with you. Or sorry, Ramban, your idea does not last very long. Okay, so we've got this idea that Nachmanides has, that species reproduce just like themselves with no changes. Shene'amar b'kulam, after all, in Genesis 1, it describes that God created all the species, leminehu, according to their type, according to their species. V'hu sibata mishkav shenarbia behemot zo im zo, l'kiyum haminim, Kasher yavo ha'anashim al anashim le'pirivia. And this is the reason, right, that God created that animals would have sex one with the other, right, just like men and women do, in order to reproduce. And now he says the important part. V'hamarkiv shnei minim. But if you try to breed together two different species, here he's talking about animals really, mishaneh u'machish b'maseh bereshit, he changes and undermines the work of creation. Ki'ilu yachshov shelo hishlima kadosh baruch hu ba'olamo kol hatzorach. It's like he thinks that the Creator didn't finish the job. V'yachpotzu la'azor b'briyato shel olam. And he wants to come along and help God to create the world. L'hosif bo briot, and to create more species. Now, Nachmanides is saying that to blend species together is a theological crime. It's chutzpah. It's saying like God did a bad job and I'm going to fix what God left undone. And he goes on and he explains that another reason, which is that hybrids are sterile. Many of you have heard that a mule cannot reproduce. I hate to break the news, but it's not entirely true. Hybrids often are less fertile than their parent species, but they're not always sterile. And in many cases, hybrids are able to be more fertile than their parent species. As anybody who gardens knows, hybridized rose plants, for instance, can often be more productive, more flowering than the parent species. And in fact, contemporary biologists like Rosemary and Peter Grant, in their wonderful book, 40 Years of Evolution, a study of Darwin's finches on one of the islands in the Galapagos, it's called Daphne Major. They went back and spent 40 years studying the birds on that island, and they found that there's a great deal of hybridization, especially in a time of climate change. Right? When the climate is changing, it's getting wetter or drier or hotter, and the plants are changing, the seeds are getting larger or smaller. The animals have to adapt to that environment. It's called adaptive change. And sometimes they adapt more efficiently when another species, say a finch, comes and breeds together with the finches on an island and quickly helps them to develop, let's say, larger beaks so they can eat the larger seeds. And so sometimes hybridization can actually create a reproductive benefit for these animals. Okay, why is Ramban saying this? Well, we get the idea. God creates the world. We should sort of be custodians, stewards of the world. We get that idea. But he's basing himself also on a mystical concept. And for that, let's go to the next page. Look at the Zohar there. Now, the Zohar, as you know, was edited in the Middle Ages, although it's sort of set in a much earlier time, and who knows when it actually was written. It could be that it was written over the course of many centuries, not just by Moses de Leon, as Gershom Scholem had once said. But the thing about the Zohar is it often builds upon earlier rabbinic texts. And so one famous rabbinic text, which I don't think I gave to you, is this one. The rabbis say in Midrash Bereshit Rabbah that there is not one blade of grass in the world that does not have an angel saying to it, grow, grow. I love this. Many of us have told this midrash in educational settings where we see our children and the great mystery of their education and imagine not just the angels in heaven, but the angels of their lives, their parents, and their teachers, all telling them, grow, grow. But this idea then develops in the mystical world as saying that every life form on earth has sort of a corollary patron in the sky. You know that expression we like to say, Mazel Tov? Mazel Tov. Yes, what does Mazel Tov mean? It means have a good constellation. What? I didn't know that's what it meant. Well, yes, it does. The constellations, the stars and their arrangement in the sky were believed by our ancestors to actually determine much of what happens on Earth. And if you were born under a good constellation, then there'd be a flow of a certain type of blessing into the world. In fact, the word mazal literally means a flow. Maybe you know a nazelet in modern Hebrew is a runny nose. Anyway, I digress. So we've got this idea in the mystical times that there is a linkage between the forms of life on earth and their patrons in heaven. Here's what the Zohar says about it. Valda kativ, and this is why it says in the Torah, in our verse in Leviticus, Et chukotai tishmeru, you should keep my statutes. Begin dechol chad v'chad mimunah al mila yediah ba'alma, b'hahu chok. Because each one of them is sort of sponsored or is governed, is appointed by a specific object in the world, right? In that world as a chok. In other words, he's saying that there's a heavenly patron that governs each life form, and the connection between them is called the chok. It's called the connection, the statute. Uvigin kach, and because of this, asir lemichlep zinin laala zina bezina achra, and that's why it's forbidden to mix the species together, to mount one species on another species. He could be referring either to breeding animals like the horse and the donkey together, or he could be talking about grafting different plants together. Begin de akar lechochela v'chela me'atrahu, because that would then uproot each strength from its proper place. Ve'ichish b'familia de le'ela, and that would somehow undermine the heavenly celestial family. Ve'ichish pumbe de malka, falsifying the royal solemnity. This is the translation, by the way, of Daniel Matt, which I encourage you to look at in his wonderful translation and commentary on the Zohar. That's from volume 8. So what's going on here, according to the Zohar, is that when you breed species together, you break the linkage of heaven and earth. And I think that this is what Ramban has in mind as well. You know, Nachmanides, writing in medieval Spain, is living in the same time as the Kabbalists. In fact, he frequently refers to Kabbalistic ideas in his Torah commentary. And so according to Nachmanides, the problem with Kilayim is that you undermine the work of creation. You set yourself up as a creator, right? And you therefore destroy the linkage between heaven and earth. Now, we may disagree with all of that. We may say that Ramban is wrong. The species on earth were not all created separately. There has been species extinction. There is evolution constantly. And we might even be so bold as to say there are no patrons in the sky for the goats and the wild flowers and for the whales of the sea. That's just not what we believe. And yet, let me ask you this. Is there not some beauty and even power to this concept? The concept that life, as we observe it all around us, teeming life, beautiful life, cruel life, but life has a value to it which exceeds our grasp. Is there not a sense that the Creator and the idea that we celebrate Shabbat every week as the celebration of creation is the foundation of all of our faith? And even if things work mechanically a bit different than our ancestors thought, even if we continue to discover our own impact on the world, the idea that we worship God as the Creator and that we have a responsibility to steward this world and to try to keep it as stable as possible, to preserve the species, is there not beauty and value to that? I think there is, and as a result, I think Ramban needs to be part of our conversation, even if we disagree with some of his claims. Now we're going to skip to the Maharal. You've heard of the Maharal? Yeah, the Maharal of Prague, one of the great rabbis of the 16th century. What do you know about him? You know one thing for sure. I can't hear you, but yell it out. Yes, the Golem, the Golem. He's the rabbi who created the Golem. You know that legend that the Jews of Prague were being threatened by their neighbors and they were in their ghetto and the neighbors were coming to break down the gates of the ghetto. And this rabbi, he goes down to the riverbank and he takes some mud and he puts the mud down in his town and he inscribes the divine name of truth, the seal of truth, Emet, Aleph, Mem, Taf, and puts it on the forehead of the animal and it becomes this mud man that grows in size and saves the people. Now, this is a very beloved legend. I don't think it's found anywhere in Maharal's writings. So where did that legend come from? Well, here's my candidate, this next verse that we're going to look at. Look at reading number 8. The Maharal, referring to that story about Saturday night, the first Saturday night when God teaches Adam to create the mule, he says, some people are surprised, right? People are surprised that God in the Talmud would tell Adam to create these two different species. They're surprised because for sure this is forbidden by God to Israel because of mixed species. And now he says a line that I've never heard a rabbi say before. We're not there yet. We're almost there. But Adam could do this thing because it was good for this thing to be in the world. So he's saying that Adam, who's pre-Sinai, does an act which will later be forbidden to Jews from Mount Sinai, right? And why? Because this thing deserved to be in the world. Diversity was good for the world, all right? And even though, this is my favorite line, even though according to the Torah which God gives, this thing is forbidden as mixed species, that's only according to the Torah, he says. What? It's only according to the Torah? Yes. the Maharal is saying it's true that this is forbidden by the Torah, but it still should happen in the world. And then he points out something very logical. You know, there are a lot of species in the world that are forbidden to eat, you know, according to the Torah, right? Like the pig, for instance, or lobsters. Why do we need to have pigs and lobsters to tempt us if we can't eat them? Why? They're still created. Because they complete the world. The world is not only here for our appetite, for Jews or other humans. There are a lot of things in the world which are here just to make the world a more complete place. Right? And he says, you know, the mixing of species, it's not that it's inherently licentious or something like that, right? It's just that we are not supposed to mix these things together. Now, I'm running low on time, so I'm going to point to what the implications of this are. You've got two different perspectives. I always love this in Judaism when we find two different discourses. There's one discourse which says, we should be stewards and keep the world the way we found it. That is humble, and that is responsible and respectful, and it also is cautious because we don't know what changes will result in. On the other hand, you've got Maharal saying, hey, wait a second, the world needs to be diverse. Humans have a role to play in that. And kilayim, even though it's forbidden under certain circumstances, should be permitted under others, because with them, the world will be perfected. We also remember Maimonides, Rambam, who said that prohibition of kilayim is limited to human eating and perhaps only human agriculture in the land of Israel. Right? He didn't mention that, but that's another qualification. So then, doing it for medical purposes might be permitted. The reason I wanted to give all of these things to you is to show you how complex it is, but also to help you see that when we look at our current context, we have to also be aware that we have conflicting values. Last summer, just a year ago, I was invited to Berkeley to a conference at the university there of scientists and lawyers and ethicists and theologians, and they had invited someone from the Vatican and someone, a Muslim scholar from the University of Tehran, and me to sort of present different religious perspectives. And I presented these two different discourses which are in conflict. And with that, I want to read to you my conclusions from the responsum that I wrote. You were sent the link. I encourage you to read the whole thing. It's a long paper, but I hope you'll find it interesting. On page 44, these were the conclusions that I came to about kilayim and its implications for genetic engineering. Number one, the Torah's ban on kilayim, the physical blending of different species of plants and animals, does not extend formally to the modification of gene sequences via the introduction of foreign DNA in order to convey a specific capability in the new organism. Jews may benefit from the fruits of hybridized plants and animals, but they should not intentionally create entirely new species. So using the idea of taking a sequence of the genome to put it into another animal, right, to modify a species is one thing. Creating a completely new species is a different thing. Two, the health implications of genetically modified foods must be examined on an individual basis without making broad assumptions that all GMOs are either salubrious or dangerous. The Torah's command that we guard our health requires vigilant attention to the safety of our food supply. So I don't say that all GMOs are dangerous and therefore you shouldn't use them, but I also don't say that they're all safe. Right? We need to study these things. We need to alert consumers to the presence of GMOs. We need to do longitudinal studies to make sure that what we're doing is safe. Three, when considering the genetic modifications of organisms, Jews must, as informed and engaged citizens, seek to minimize animal suffering and to protect extant species. We didn't speak about this today, but a lot of experimentation creates mutant animals which can suffer terribly. And so we need to be responsible for the well-being of laboratory animals and other types of animals which are often subjected to terrible suffering for uncertain benefit. Then I have another set of conclusions regarding the modification of humans ourselves. 4, the creation of dual species that are human and animal and chimeric is forbidden. 5, modifications of the human genome intended to combat illness are permitted, for they may promote human health and protect human dignity. What I'm doing here is I'm saying I don't want us to create a post-human species that will have, say, broad spectrum viral immunity, right? By creating a different type of creature, which is like a human, but is lacking some of the core features of humans, right? Finally, a very complicated topic, which I'm going to end with, has to do with the boundary between therapeutic medicinal modifications and enhancements. What is the line there? Is there a line there? Listen, a lot of things which you could do to help someone who is ill, you can give that same therapy to a healthy person to make them stronger. Take somebody who's got MS, and they're losing some of the myelin, that's the sheath around their neurons, and they're losing brain function. Let's say there's a way to repair that. You know, healthy people also lose their brain function as they age. I've become more forgetful in my 50s, I've noticed that. But I'm basically a healthy 52-year-old. If I could take that medication and get my memory back to the way it was when I was in my 20s, wouldn't I want that? So is this about medicine, or is this about enhancement? What about athletes? You know, maybe the same medications that could restore muscle function to people with muscular dystrophy could be given to an athlete to allow them to run faster and jump higher. Is that permissible? At some point, we begin to worry about the modifications we're making will not only change our biology, but change our culture, change our very concept of what it means to be alive, give us a sense of arrogance that we are not servants of God, but we ourselves are gods. This is the great danger that I discern, and that we need to keep in mind. We can use these tools to enhance our life, but we should not use them to replace God and install ourselves as the new divinities. So thank you for listening to my presentation. We're now going to engage in some conversation. I hope that we've received some of your questions, and I look forward to that conversation.
Thank you. So fascinating. And I certainly do encourage everyone to read the entire response. Okay, we do have some questions. And I'll start with one from Jeff Friedman in Rockville, Maryland. And his question really was getting at what you were just sharing in your, when you shared your conclusions.
Right.
So there's this tension between, as you said, the creation of dual species, human/animal, is forbidden. On the other hand, modifications of the human genome intended to combat illness are permitted. So he wanted to ask about this, and the frame that he offered was the commandment of Chai Bahem, that we should live by the mitzvot. They're meant to bring us life, not the opposite. So how do you balance texts opposed to crossbreeding with that Chai Bahem? And the example that he gives is if there are technologies that can be used to modify pigs with human antigens to allow for xenotransplantation, which could reduce, maybe even eliminate organ transplant shortages. Would you suggest those be prohibited or permitted, or why?
Okay, so first of all, Jeff Friedman in Rockville, Maryland, I think we've met, and I think you were very helpful to me. I think I taught an early version of this paper, and I think that you gave me some information. I may be getting you confused with another person, but I thank you, and you have a footnote in my paper. So, all right, if you can modify the genome of a pig so that will lack the antigens that evoke an immune response from humans when they receive the organ as a transplantation, should that be permitted? I think the answer has to be yes, that we are, after all, required to heal illness, and we are required to try to extend life. And so if it were possible to, let's say, a human being who has heart failure and is not able to receive a human heart transplant, and a mechanical heart is not yet a viable tool, although we're getting close to that. If you could implant a pig heart and you modify that pig in a way that the human host will not reject that organ, it would seem that that would be permissible. In fact, just last week we had a conference that I participated in on brain death, and that's a whole other topic. But one of the main sources of human organs for donation is from people who've been declared to be brain dead, and yet it's a controversial protocol, and some people would say that a person with heartbeat who has many other functions, even without brainstem function, is really not dead, and taking their heart and other vital organs out is murder. And so obviously it would be a better thing if we could do that with animals like pigs. That said, we shouldn't be modifying species without a compelling reason. And in this case, I think saving human life would be that reason. And finally, we still are liable for tsar balei chaim, which is causing excessive suffering to animals. And so what is excessive? Of course, that's a subjective term. Torturing animals is forbidden. But we are allowed to use their bodies and their labor, actually, to help us in our lives, to eat them and to create medications. And so that's the boundary we've got. But I think that we would be allowed, and I say that here, to modify the genomes of other animals for the sake of protecting their health and also human health. I do want to mention that last thing. Some genetic modifications are for the sake of the animal's health. And I just want to note one thing. We all know that there's a terrible problem of poaching for elephants, killing elephants in Africa to take their ivory. Well, it's an interesting phenomenon that because hunters have killed elephants which have tusks and spared elephants which don't have tusks, which is a naturally occurring variation, now you suddenly have a lot more elephants without tusks in Africa, and so if you could sort of grow elephants and intentionally deprive them of their tusks, you might be able to rescue the species, even though they would be tuskless elephants, but at least there wouldn't be poachers trying to shoot them for their ivory.
All right, so following from that a little bit, Daniel Graber at the Oceanside Jewish Center, Oceanside, New York, kind of asking a question about how we think about this whole question of us and God, and sort of who has the right to co-create. He writes, often when talking about tikkun olam, repairing the world, we talk about being God's partners in creation, fixing the brokenness inherent in the world. Does this aid a response to Ramban's accusation that kilayim is an undermining of God and creation, or should we perhaps find different language for the good deeds we do in the world?
Very nice. Hi, Daniel. Know you too. Anyway, so yes, of course, we speak about l'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, which I actually don't know what that phrase means. I translate it typically as to prepare the world for the kingship of heaven. But certainly the rabbis had this idea that there could be something broken in the world that needs to be repaired. We also have a concept of shutafo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a partner of the Holy One in creating the world. That's an important concept that we teach our children, that they should be God's partner. In fact, one of my theories about Shabbat, the reason why we're not supposed to modify the world around us is for the sake of humility, that we would remember that God made this world, we didn't make the world, and we should, on one day of the week at least, just appreciate the world as we find it and not try to modify it. So that is sort of a break. It's sort of you've got a sense of humility should slow us down and not make us feel like we are going to replace God. And like you say, however, we do have an obligation to heal. V'chai bakam, we had Rapo Yirapeh, you shall surely heal another person. We have an idea that saving life can precede almost any other commandment. And so we have many Jewish values which do motivate us to make interventions for the sake of therapy, for the sake of human benefit, and yet we still have a little bit of a holdback. And I'm saying that the kilayim mitzvah is here to remind us to be humble, that you are not the creator. You are simply trying to improve the world around you as God has commanded.
All right, we have a couple questions coming in on hot new topics, so we'll see how many we can squeeze in. Bob Braitman, I hope I'm saying your name right, in Boston. He writes, we recently have learned about epigenetics, where gene expression can not only be affected by life experience, such as stress, starvation, etc., but actually these changes to genes can be passed on to future generations. Since our goal is to reduce the impact of these life stresses, are we then performing a type of genetic engineering? Is this wrong? Not wrong.
Right. I mentioned epigenetics in my presentation, and if you look at the actual paper, there's, I think, a good paragraph with some footnotes to some of the scientific literature about methylation, which is one of the methods in which gene expression is governed. And I also read some studies which indicate that when a organism's DNA is kind of modified by their experience, for example, experience of stress, that sometimes that shift can actually be conveyed, inherited to the next generation. I can't claim that I know much about this, but your question seems to say, well, so just by being alive and like stubbing our toe and having stress or something, we're causing changes. You know, there's a famous experiment done on not a treadmill, on a cycle, you know, spinning type of thing, where resistance was on one leg but not on the other leg. You know, and they had athletes do this weird type of exercise where they were exercising their right leg but not their left leg, and they found that not only did the muscles of the right leg get bulkier, you know, were trained, but there was actually genetic change that was happening in the muscle tissue, you know, that was exercise. So there is an actual genetic impact. So you're asking, well, if we can't do genetic engineering, then should we not be able to like live either? Well, of course, that, if I understood you correctly.
I think he's asking if we're trying to mitigate against those stresses, does that constitute a problematic genetic engineering?
Yeah, I don't understand why that would be a problematic type of genetic engineering. This is an example of a medicinal intervention, which we have a broad permission to engage in. The biggest challenges that I'm seeing are about transgenics, about mingling two different species together. But training our bodies to be able to respond to their environment in a more healthy and productive way, I think that's the very essence of being a person. You know, there's a famous interpretation of the verse that we say on Shabbat at Kiddush, Asher bara Elohim la'asod. Bara la'asod, which God created to do. What is created to do? Right? It seems like a duplication of words, right? So they say, bara la'asod, God created us, la'asod, to create, for us to create, you know, and so we are, in our very nature as humans, inventive, and we have to make interventions in order to improve our environment and even our own bodies.
All right, let's see if we can squeeze in 2 more in 3 remaining minutes. All right, our own Josie Gray, Director of Institutional Grants here at JTS, is asking this. What should we think about 3-parent children being produced by Russian scientists? Very controversial, and yet it enables the main 2 parents to have a child when otherwise they would be infertile. Is that a medically viable reason?
Yeah, so you know, most of the genetic information that's inherited by people comes from the sperm provided by a man and the ovum provided by a woman, and most of her genetic information is in the nucleus. However, within the cell itself, there are these other structures called mitochondria, some of which have their own DNA. It's a simpler DNA, but it does exist. And so there is a possibility of taking just the nucleus of the mother and then putting it into a cell from another woman, right? And then fertilizing that with the sperm. So then you would actually have DNA contributed, if I understand correctly, by 3 different people. The woman who's providing the cell is also providing the mitochondria, which has some DNA in it. It could be that the mother who's providing the main, the nucleus, is not able, her cells are not able to be fertilized somehow. Maybe there's a problem with the cell wall. And so by putting that nucleus into the cell of a different woman, then they'll have a viable pregnancy. Is this forbidden, Josie wants to know? Well, it's complicated because, we like to think that we know who's the parent. There's one genetic parent and the other genetic parent. And yet, it would seem to me that Judaism doesn't really regulate genes per se. And if the result will be a healthy human being, then that would seem to be permitted. We do have to worry a little bit because, we have prohibitions on incest, so my children can't, that can't reproduce with each other. If they did, the result would be a mamzer, a child that was forbidden to marry. Well, how would you keep track then of these 3-parent children? You'd have to actually also keep track of the surrogate or this other woman who provided the cell with the mitochondria, the ovum without the nucleus, and make sure that their descendants didn't marry together. So I could see some complications, but they don't strike me as so powerful that you would prevent this. You know that the state of Israel has been incredibly aggressive and in a positive sense with fertility methods because of the great desire to have children. Many things which were not permitted in other countries are being permitted in Israel, and I think that this is one of them.
So in our final minute, I'm just going to riff off a comment from Carrie Mintz in Florida about organic produce. So we learn more and more about what pesticides are doing to our bodies, and if there's a correlation between genetically modified produce being hardier or for whatever other reasons needing less pesticide treatment, is that an argument to go in that direction?
Yeah, that's definitely an argument that's been used, that by making modifications to the genome, then the organism will be more naturally resistant to pests and to fungus and things like that, and therefore you wouldn't have to spray them with as much pesticide or fungicide or herbicide and things like that. So you could, in fact, have a more natural type of farming with a less natural type of species or product. But these are very controversial claims, and people in the sort of the non-GMO camp will say that this is all sort of a cascading system which will create even more complications and more interventions and a further retreat from the state of nature. I'm not a scientist, and so I try to read these things with a critical eye and be ready to modify my own position based on new information. What I will say, though, in conclusion, is that that GMOs are really a continuation of a process which goes all the way back, perhaps even to Jacob, who modified Laban's herds, so that he could have goats and sheep that had the right kind of coat and he could enrich himself. So we have this idea of intervention. It's part of being human. What we also need to maintain is a sense of caution, that we don't create changes which will be permanent and inherited and toxic to the environment, and also humility, that we remember that we are in the end also creatures of God whom we worship, and in this way we maintain our own sense of humility, which is perhaps the greatest of our qualities.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Nevins, for this really substantive exploration of how our sources can help us think about pressing issues at hand. We want to thank all of you for joining us, and if you take a moment to share some feedback at the bottom of your screen, we would love to read it, either about this webinar or thoughts or suggestions for future webinars. And we hope you have a great summer. We look forward to learning with you again in the fall.
Thank you.